guys, my name is Deborah Hartner and I'm like super excited to tell you guys today about Basil Bernstein. He taught us a lot of stuff and it's just really cool, do you know what I mean? He taught us about speech and stuff and the way that we educate and stuff, and speech kind of is education.
Miss Hartner?
And the way, yeah?
Why are you talking like that?
What do you mean? This is how I talk. This is how I speak at home. It's how I learn to talk.
Okay, but we're not at home. We're in school, and I think you should probably speak a little more professionally.
Oh, right. Okay, I'm going to start over. Hello everyone, my name is Deborah Hartner, and today we will be discussing Mr. Basil Bernstein and the social interactionist theory of language development. Now, Mr. Basil Bernstein taught us a lot about students and the way that they speak and how those different speech codes relate to the way in which they learn and the way that they feel in their school environment. Now, Mr. Bernstein did a lot of this linguistic work to learn about the way that students learn, and we can use this information even still today in our classrooms to make sure that our students feel comfortable with the way that they are learning. Now, before we begin, it's important to know that there are two types of speech codes. There is elaborated speech code and also restrictive speech code. And both are important to know and understand when we are looking at our students. So what Mr. Bernstein did with these two speech codes, he learned that different students have different types of speech codes. So for example, the restrictive speech code. Restrictive speech code relates to the kind of speaking that is very colloquial, the way that people talk in their homes, maybe texting to one another. It's kind of that jargon that we use with our friends. That's very kind of loose and general, and we understand what each other are saying because we're really close, we're friends, we get it, you know what I'm saying? That's a type of restrictive speech code. There is also the more elaborated speech code. Elaborated speech code is a more professional way of speaking. It's more clear, it's more detailed, it uses precise vocabulary, and people who use that type of language find it very easy to understand. Now, what Mr. Bernstein discovered was that students who were in the working class used primarily the restricted speech code. In other words, the more colloquial speech code, the way that they spoke within their homes and within their families, that was very culturally based and that really helped them fit into their community. Now, it's important to recognize that this type of speech code is not to be disvalued. This restricted speech code makes us feel comfortable. It makes us feel at home. It's a way that we relate to other people. And it's a wonderful way for us to communicate with one another. But Mr. Bernstein found that students in the working class were typically using just that one type of restricted speech code. And Bernstein also discovered that students who were in a more middle class setting, that they were used to that restrictive speech code that they use at their home and at their Starbucks and the coffee shop, and that was part of the type of code that they used in those less informal settings in the middle class. But they also use the more elaborated speech code in more professional environments. And so those students were used to that type of speech code also. So what Mr. Bernstein discovered was, as these students were coming into an educational setting, the students in the middle class had an advantage over the students in the working class, because of course we know in educational settings we prefer to use that elaborated speech code, that more professional type of jargon in our writing, in the way that we speak, in the way that we educate. That's the type of code that is primarily used in our educational system, both during Mr. Bernstein's time and then also again today. So it's very important for our students to learn that professional type of language. But Mr. Bernstein found that these working class individuals were really at a disadvantage because they weren't used to that type of more elaborated language. So they really were coming into these educational systems and feeling a bit uncomfortable. The teacher would start speaking to them in this professional manner, and it's not a way that they were used to speaking in their homes. And so immediately they felt almost kind of threatened by that and not a part of the community. And what Mr. Bernstein found is that these students in the working class maybe had incredibly high IQs and had great potential to learn. But because they felt uncomfortable in their educational environment, they did not succeed academically. And what happened was these students in the working class, he found, had a lower level of achievement academically, and then additionally, they weren't able to even receive the same kinds of jobs and things of that nature as students who had been brought up in the middle class who were exposed to both types of speech patterns. In fact, Dr. Basil Bernstein did an experiment with 2 5-year-olds. One was from the working class and one was from the middle class. And he showed each of these 5-year-olds 4 pictures. And he told the 5-year-olds to make a story about the pictures. And he found that the child from the middle class was able to make a story that had many details, and it used that elaborated language pattern. And the story that that 5-year-old child created, you would have been able to understand it without seeing the pictures. It had a plot, it had a beginning, it had a middle, it had an end, it had a clear series of events, and it was clear language development. Now, the working class child who he showed these 4 pictures to, that child was able to create a story, but it wasn't one primarily related to language. It was a story that you would have had to see the pictures to be able to understand the story that that child had created. So what Dr. Bernstein found was that the student in the middle class had kind of a better handle on the language development using that elaborated language that incorporated details, and the student in the working class who had just experienced a restrictive speech code was not able to make a detailed story. And what he found was those students in the working class were then not able to receive the same jobs. They had more kind of hands-on jobs and things that didn't require as many verbal skills, even though that child may have been entirely capable of doing an incredible job and using his mind because of the educational system was focused on the elaborated language code. That child did not have the same opportunities. So for us as teachers, I think it is important for us to know that about students because, as Dr. Bernstein said, that restrictive language code is extremely important and not to be disvalued. Okay, students come into our classroom and it is our job as a teacher to understand their background and their culture and to use that as a way to make our classroom all the more beautiful. The diversity and the different backgrounds that we come from are what make us a great learning environment. And we never want one of our students to feel uncomfortable because of choices that we're making in our classroom. So our challenge as teachers is to find how can we teach our students good diction, professional way of speaking and writing, but at the same time within our classroom to make sure that all students feel comfortable and welcome regardless of their background or speech code that they use. So as we continue on, I'd like for us to kind of think of a few discussion questions that maybe we can use to talk about Dr. Bernstein and the way that speech codes influence our educational system, even still today. The first question I'd like for you to think about is, what is restricted speech code? What does that term mean? How does it relate to those students? The second is, what is elaborated speech code? What does that mean for those students? An additional question to think about is, what did Bernstein discover about working class children's speech code in the educational system. How did those students' speech code fit into that educational system, and how did it affect their learning? And the last question I want us to think about is, how can we as teachers help ensure our students feel comfortable in our classroom regardless of their speech code? Thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned a little bit more today about Dr. Bernstein.